Thanks for being here, everyone. I'm Anna Dyson. I'm the Assistant Director for the Women in Engineering program. And today we're going to chat about the imposter syndrome, ways to cope with it, and we'll certainly focus a little bit on whether or not we have it. So hopefully you are seeing the imposter syndrome slide. And I want to start with a disclaimer. This work is work that is done by Dr. Valerie Young. She wrote a great book called The Secret Thoughts of Successful Women. And you can see more about her and that book on her site, which is there. You can Google it, but it is a great book if you're looking for a little bit more in-depth than the 45 minutes or so we have today. So I'm also a big proponent of improving our self-awareness. So self-awareness is, I think, the pathway to deeper understanding about how we operate. And the more we know about how we operate, I think the better we are at interacting with others. We're better at our relationships. We're better at managing other people's emotions, but it only comes from being more clued into how you operate. I also think that it's a pathway into increased empathy, which in my opinion, is something we need more of. So self-awareness is something that we're going to be thinking about today. So step one is, do we suffer? Do you suffer from imposter syndrome, which I've abbreviated there? And then we're going to talk about what it is exactly, a little bit about why we should care. And then there's some gendered differences as it relates to stereotype threat, as well as this concept of stereotype threat, which is something that we'll talk very briefly about. Then 7 reasons why we might suffer from imposter syndrome, and then some ways to cope. And so the first set of questions here is for us to think critically about, do we suffer? And some people may know instantly, yes, I totally have this. A lot of times people who chalk up their success to luck or timing or error suffer from imposter syndrome. You might think that if I can do it, anybody can do it. So you're sort of minimizing your talents. Some people agonize over the smallest flaws in their work. So one thing wrong, and then you just are overly focused on that. Maybe you're crushed by constructive criticism. You're just really not able to accept that. Maybe when you succeed, you secretly feel like you just fooled them again. You've gotten away with something. Maybe you worry that it's just a matter of time before you're found out. Personally, I do agonize over the flaws, and it is difficult to accept criticism. I tend to, get really focused on that instead of the body of the work. So some more questions that might help you to figure out. Do you secretly worry that others will find out that you're not as bright and capable as they think you are? So, this concept of other people's perception of you. Do you sometimes shy away from challenges because you have this nagging self-doubt? Like, I just don't want to take that on because I'm not good enough to do that. Do you live in fear about being found out, discovered, or unmasked? When you succeed, do you think, I fooled him this time, but I might not be so lucky next time? So I know some people are chiming in the chat. So yes, we've all sort of felt these. These are all very common. And so, and these could come and go, right? You might feel really good on one day and not be plugged into the imposter syndrome things, and they creep back in. So it's not necessarily a constant. So welcome to the club. We have a very large club. There are no membership cards. We all are included in this group of millions and millions of people, and people of all genders, ages, identities, races, religions, socioeconomic classes, educational backgrounds, and people that are in the Imposter Syndrome Club represent every type of work done. And we'll get into some of that in just a few minutes here. So it is really important to note that we are not sick and we are not broken. That this is, there are some real reasons why people suffer from imposter syndrome, and that we feel these things, which we're going to go into here in just a few minutes. So the definition of imposter syndrome refers to people who have a persistent belief in their lack of intelligence, skills, or competence. So it is really easy to misconstrue imposter syndrome as just, no self-esteem, which it is not, because it is possible to feel insecure without feeling like a fraud. So imposter syndrome is really focused on this belief that you have of yourself a lack of intelligence, skills, or competence. And as we discuss some of the reasons why, I think it'll become clear how these have come about in our lives. So I want to focus a little bit on how we discuss success, because success has a very clear connection to how we feel about imposter syndrome. How do you explain your success? What are the things that you say about your own self and your accomplishments as it relates to success? Have you, or do you ever notice how other people explain their success? And just as a side note, when you notice, do you see differences with regard to gendered differences in how folks explain success? And then what are some of the phrases you've used or heard before with regard to success? And one of the really important things that we're going to focus on are some things that you can do to change how much of the imposter syndrome is present for you. So here are some examples that you may have heard or seen. So sure, I'm successful, but. So the but is the qualifier of yes, whatever you're proud of, you put a qualifier on, like I just got lucky, or I was in the right place at the right time. The stars lined up. It's only because they like me that I got that promotion. They let everybody in. Someone must have made a terrible mistake. I had a lot of help, which is true. We all have a lot of help to get where we're going. I had the connections. They're just being nice. They felt sorry for me. So it is this qualifier at the end of a success or an accomplishment or something that you're proud of that is feeding that imposter syndrome. And so you want to think about how you can stop at the I'm successful and not put the qualifier in. And there are two things that we, two sort of words that are overly used that we really try to get people to stop using in this way. And they are the words only and just. And so, for example, particularly with students, we try to think about students that are maybe early in their career, maybe first year students. A lot of times they will have interactions with recruiters and say things like, I'm only a first year student. And so we have to kind of go back and re-educate and talk about the accomplishment of being finishing high school, of getting into college, of getting into UT, of getting into engineering, so sort of when you put it in this larger context, you start to see how using these words to minimize accomplishments are really not very helpful. So I invite you to think about the times where you use the words only and just, and what can you do to stop that or remove those from your written communication and certainly your online, certainly your face-to-face conversation. All right, so we're going to switch gears. Let's talk about reasons why you might feel like an imposter. So the first reason, the number one reason, is that most likely you were raised by humans. And parents and teachers and other significant adults really shape our early expectations of ourselves. And there are all kinds of overt and subtle messages that we get in our life, particularly early on, that shape how we think about ourselves, that shape our willingness to accept accomplishments. So oftentimes people will say, yeah, I don't want to talk about my accomplishments because then I'm bragging, or then I'm going to seem, cocky or overconfident, because that's what society has taught us to do, is to downplay. And in definitely in family units, there are labels typically assigned to siblings. So if you have siblings or close cousins, were there labels assigned to each of you? And in the chat, if you feel like it, you can share your label. I'm the middle child. I was the dumb one in the family. I have an older sister and an older cousin that are the same age. We grew up together. They were very smart. They were very bookish. They were all, so they were the smart ones. I was the dumb one. And then there were other labels assigned in my family. And so that is a very common experience that we all have, where these labels are assigned. So some people, the oldest, are the caretakers or the ones that are in charge. The youngest are the lucky ones. They get everything. They're the most spoiled. Parents are typically a lot more mellowed out by then. So there's a lot of shifts that happen within that family structure. The second reason you might feel like an imposter is that you're a student, or you've been a student. You definitely know what that feels like. So what other group literally has their knowledge and skills tested and graded on a daily basis? Students are in a particularly difficult position because they are not in positions of power. The power dynamic is off balance. And for UT students, in order to be admitted to UT, the majority of students have to have been nearly perfect in their life to be here. And so this can create imposter syndrome type feelings, because what if you're not in that top 10%? What is that sense of self that you have? What if you were a top 10%, but at a very small high school, and you're now in this environment competing with students that came from really large, very well-resourced high schools. So even though there's a lot of commonalities with students in terms of skills and abilities, there are disparities that create these feelings. And so we have to be very mindful of what that means. We have to be mindful of what that means when students leave and they go into the workforce. So a lot of dynamics there as it relates to being a student. So the third reason is you operate in this organizational culture that feeds self-doubt. So hello, this is academia, right? This is the way that this higher education system operates. It operates on a system of challenging ideas, and ideas are really, our way of showing sort of how we think, what we are mindful of. And this scholarly debate, this rigorous investigation of ideas and thoughts can be very hostile and derisive. And so it can really push people into feelings of self-doubt because people are constantly challenging their ideas. Added on top of that is, what if you're in an area like engineering or a lot of STEM where there is not a critical mass of the people whose identity that you relate with? So this can add even more pressure on top of individuals in terms of their feeling like they belong. So we're going to take a pause from this list of 7 reasons and talk briefly about stereotype threat, because it relates to this idea of feeling like an imposter. So Claude Steele wrote this amazing book. The picture of the book is here. It's called Whistling Vivaldi. And it is an idea that he coined a stereotype threat. So stereotype threat is the experience of anxiety or concern in a situation where the person, so where you typically, has the potential to confirm a negative stereotype about that social group that you identify with. So gender, class, race, et cetera, all those different identities. So this idea is that if you're the only woman in the room, or you're the only Latina in the room, or you're the only Black person in the room, then you are then representing your entire social group identity, and you have this added burden that you are confirming the negative stereotypes about that identity. That adds tremendous burden to your ability to interact in a way that is fully present. So the book is fascinating, and it really ties into this concept of imposter syndrome.
Hello, this is Christine Kirby. I've never connected these two together with our own, I guess, expectations, our self-expectations and the stereotypes, and then how that plays into imposter syndrome. I've always looked at imposter syndrome as being like exclusive, and it's only some people just have it, like, and even men, could have it. Anybody could have imposter syndrome. And I guess my question was, it may not necessarily be always stereotypes feeding into it, but it could be upbringing and self-expectation that can play into it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, these two concepts for me were linked. I'm not suggesting that the scholarly research has connected them, but for me that made sense, that if you are in a minoritized group of some sort, you then have this added burden of stereotype threat that could sort of layer in or on top of, or interact with the feelings that you already have from whatever that came from. Now, it could be the same set of reasons because you're in a minoritized group. It could just be the way you were raised by your human parents or teachers and so forth. It could be the environment that you're in. I think all of it together is this really messy soup that helps us to feel the way we feel. And for me, at least, it helps to explain it. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning, the self-awareness is so critical because I think once you're able to name the things that you're feeling, you're then able to start to figure out strategies for coping or moving past them, or at least acknowledging what they are. So let's keep going. Let's go to number 4 here. The fourth reason that you might feel like an imposter is that you work alone. So this is the first imposter syndrome workshop I'm doing via Zoom. COVID has definitely changed our ability to gather and to do things in person where you can receive feedback from others. You can understand and interpret body language. But this isolation that we have now has a detrimental effect on our ability to cope with some of these feelings. So if you normally work alone, some or all of the time, this can feed into these feelings of imposter syndrome. People who are self-employed, they're their own boss, there's no real job description, no management feedback, no sort of feedback loop of any sort, can really suffer from imposter syndrome in that you don't really know how am I doing, because you don't have a gauge to figure out how you're doing in relation to others. The fifth reason is that you work in a creative field. So folks that work in that write, design, act, musicians, artists, sort of the things that you create that you share then with the world. This and it may not be your work, it could be your hobby, right? So it could, we probably all have some sort of creative side to what we do. But there are these questions that we have of, will they like it? What if they hate it? You've poured your heart and soul and your mindfulness into whatever the thing is, and now you're about to release it to the world for judgment. And so that's really can be very debilitating for some folks. The sixth reason is that you are a stranger in a strange land. So you might be operating outside of your cultural zone or your socioeconomic class. Maybe your work environment is foreign. Maybe you are a first generation. Maybe it's geographically foreign. There are a lot of other identities that we carry and that we hold that can contribute to feeling like a stranger. So what are some of those for yourself? Obviously, I'm not going to ask you to share, but it is an important exercise to do, to think about all of your different identities and how are those maybe incorporated into these feelings for yourself. It could be your background as far as your family. Is your family first gen in this country or in another country? Did you grow up overseas? So all of those things can contribute to this idea of being a stranger, feeling just like, I don't really know where I'm going. I don't have a map to figure out what to do. And the seventh reason is that you represent your entire social group or identity. So this is back to that stereotype threat stuff again. It's really this concept that whatever your identity or set of identities are that you are carrying, that you are then going to be, carrying the torch, this pressure to be that super competent because of that identity or set of identities that you are carrying into this group. So there are some very legit reasons why we have imposter syndrome. And actually, stereotypes do matter because they're so easily internalized. We are so inundated with images in media that sort of force our psyche into believing that these stereotypes are true. And even the positive stereotypes really limit us as well, right? So positive stereotypes can be just as debilitating to certain identities and groups as the negative ones. And so one thing to really think about for yourself is really focused on what are the identities that I hold in high regard for myself? How do I identify? And then finding the groups, the affinity groups that can serve as your community, and they can really be a powerful buffer against these ideas of self-doubt because you're surrounding yourself with people who have similar identities, similar experiences, and you can share these feelings in a safer environment. So I want to also talk about the gendered differences. So imposter syndrome affects everyone, but it seems to affect women more. And it may affect women more in certain areas, particularly in higher ed and other areas where women are underrepresented. And research confirms that men regard themselves to be more knowledgeable, secure, and capable than women rate themselves. So, men are less likely to use those two words that I suggested you remove, only and just. And people are more likely to attribute men's success to their ability and women's to luck. So there are gendered ideas, gendered stereotypes in our society of how we attribute success based on that. And so there are definitely, double standards. There are these stereotypes, but language is particularly important. And so these gendered language differences are key. So on one side, you have, commanding, right? That is a word used to describe men typically. And then for women, the word typically is bossy. And so you can see how these language differences feed into these ideas of not only stereotype, but of imposter syndrome. So it's really important that you pay attention to the language that you use to describe coworkers. And are you using different language based on gender? And if you are, think about how you can change that. We rarely hear of men being described as pushy, but that is a definite gendered term used to describe women who are trying to be persistent. So I love this quote. Men are taught to apologize for their weakness and women for their strengths. And so when we think back to the first reason that we might have imposter syndrome and that we were raised by humans, a lot of times that those influences from family, teachers, friends, they're very gendered in how we are socialized. And women are taught to downplay their accomplishments and their strengths. And so we need to think about these things as we not only mentor others, but think about them for ourselves. All right, so we need to switch gears now. We kind of know what the problem is. Let's focus on how do we cope with this, because that's really what we need to be focused on is now some people cope with imposter syndrome by being over prepared, and they just work. They just have this Herculean effort. Every aspect of your work is approached as if it was crucial. So these are how we cope. These are not necessarily suggestions of what you should do. But you might see yourself in some of these coping mechanisms, and you can start to think about how could you do some things differently. Some people overwork and some people hold back. So this holding back is this idea that if I'm going to fail, better people think I'm lazy than stupid, right? This less holding back allows less of a reason to be judged on your work or on your performance. So there's two coping strategies. Probably somewhere in the middle is where you want to be, right? You don't want to overwork. You don't want to hold back. And at some point, you need to sort of figure out a balance of the two. So some people maintain this low profile or ever-changing profile, always flying under the radar. So you can see this with folks that are changing majors frequently or switching jobs or just sort of bouncing from one thing or another. So other people use charm or perceptiveness to win approval. So they're sort of not a low profile. They're sort of operating with this idea that they're going to charm themselves into success, right? So this is the only reason I'm successful is because they like me, right? This is this calculated use of humor to deflect attention from maybe what you feel like is fraudulent. So again, somewhere in the middle here, right? You don't want to be flying under the radar. You want to obviously have some humor and charm in your life, but probably not on either end of the spectrum. Procrastination is definitely one of the coping mechanisms. I feel like we probably all could own up to this. This is an easy thing to identify. It is a difficult thing to overcome, but it gives you this out. Because if your work is subpar, I just waited till the last minute. And so the idea of procrastination, when you start to feel like you're doing that, you might start exploring why you're feeling some imposter syndrome creeping in. All right, so the opposite or sort of the extreme of procrastination is the never finishing. And you may know people, or you may have things in your life where you've procrastinated to the extreme, which just means you're never going to finish it. And we do that because it shields you from the criticism that could come. So turning in something late because you procrastinated, some people just never turn it in because they don't want to hear, well, why was this late? So it could be a variety of things, right? You may have started writing a book and you never finish it. You could start on a hobby project and you lose interest. But these are all ways that we cope with those feelings of feeling like an imposter. So the last coping mechanism is self-sabotage. So there's lots of examples of this, unfortunately. And this can also be self-destructive behavior to obscure your accomplishments. So you might think about a scenario if you were a student and you procrastinated because you were struggling in the class because you felt like an imposter, you felt like you couldn't ask for help. And so it got so bad that you had to drop a class, or you sort of self-sabotage all the way down into a sort of destructive kind of behavior. You know, not to go into detail, but, you know, folks that might have substance abuse or other addictive kinds of issues might have, you know, this sort of self-sabotage, right? You're shielding and deflecting what you're worried about to behaviors that, you know, distract you from dealing with those feelings. So self-sabotage, obviously you don't want to be here, but this is something to be mindful of if you are spiraling in a set of behaviors that might sort of get out of hand into self-destructive behavior. So I want to do a quick exercise with you. Write down 3 things that you are proud about of yourself. So these can also be thought of as your strengths. And I want you to do that without qualification. So 3 things that you are proud of about yourself. These help to start on this path of overcoming our feelings of imposter syndrome. And then when you've thought through those or finished that, then think about 3 recent accomplishments that you could talk about in an interview that you are proud of, that you are able to do, able to talk about without qualification. So remember back to taking out the everything after the but. So 3 accomplishments that you could talk about in an interview. And maybe what you want to do today is just jot down these 2 activities that you can do later when you're feeling it. If you're not able to do it today, at least jot these 2 things down and kind of come back to them in the next day or so. There are some other tips that I have for you to overcome imposter syndrome. And the first one is to go back and look at your resume and rewrite it and edit it so that you are adding your accomplishments, your awards, and those things that you have previously omitted. Because you have been given this message that you shouldn't be bragging, you shouldn't be, you know, overconfident, you shouldn't be, you know, tooting your own horn. It's a great line that we hear all the time, but go back and rewrite it. Put everything in there. And then you can look at it with a more critical eye and decide if you want to keep everything or not. The second thing is to speak up without self-judgment. Remember to notice when you use the words only and just. Notice when you make a declarative statement and then put but and then add some other qualifier and try to remove that from your writing in your email and from your talking points when you're interacting with others. The third thing you can do is to write yourself a letter of recommendation and look at all of those accomplishments and attributes that you have. So write the letter like you were writing it for your best friend and say all of the nice things that you would say about your best friend about yourself, and do it without judgment. Obviously, you're not going to share it with me or anyone else. So you can do this exercise and have a little fun with it, and then start to see all of the great things and appreciate all of the great strengths and things about yourself. And then the last piece of advice for overcoming imposter syndrome is to accept the next compliment that you receive graciously and without making an excuse. You simply say thank you. There's no qualifier. There's no anything. You just say thank you.